On a summer morning in 1941, as the sun rose over the endless fields of Eastern Europe, millions of German soldiers simultaneously crossed the Soviet border. The roar of tank engines, artillery fire, and aircraft blended into a deadly symphony that thundered across a front stretching over 2,900 kilometers. Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the largest invasion in human history, had begun. Hitler believed that in just 8 weeks the Soviet Union would collapse. He was confident that with Blitzkrieg, the lightning war Germany would crush the Red Army and seize Moscow before winter arrived. This was more than a military operation. It was the greatest gamble of the century, a campaign that would decide the fate of Europe, the Soviet Union, and the Nazi Empire itself. Since early 1941, signs of war had spread across eastern Germany and occupied Poland. Night after night, convoys of trucks, tanks, and fuel trains moved quietly eastward. Hundreds of thousands of young soldiers, most barely in their 20s, received orders to stand by for deployment, but few knew their true destination. They were told only this: a glorious mission awaits. In every German camp, propaganda echoed through the ranks: we bring civilization to the east to cleanse it of Bolshevik savages. Officers stirred the men with fiery speeches, filling them with the belief that they were opening the gates of a new Aryan era. No one spoke of the mud, the blood, or the Russian winter that awaited them. Meanwhile, across the border, the people of the Soviet Union lived in a fragile illusion of peace. The Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 had lulled them into complacency. Even Stalin believed that Hitler would never risk fighting on 2 fronts. So when the storm came, it struck like a knife in the back. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the Luftwaffe descended like a swarm of iron demons. Within the first 24 hours, more than 3,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them still on the ground. On land, the panzer divisions surged forward like lightning, smashing through the thin Soviet defenses. 3 massive army groups tore into Soviet territory: Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow, Army Group South toward Kiev and the industrial Donbass. Within weeks, Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev had fallen. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were captured. German headlines screamed with triumph: the Bolshevik Empire is collapsing. In Berlin, Hitler smiled from the balcony of the Reich Chancellery, convinced he had achieved what Napoleon never could. In the newsreels, German soldiers laughed, waving from their panzers as they rolled through golden wheat fields. They believed they were marching toward destiny, but like Napoleon before them, they were marching straight into a frozen hell. When the first reports of the invasion reached the Kremlin, Stalin refused to believe them. "No, it's a provocation," he said quietly. Hitler wouldn't be that foolish. But as message after message arrived, entire divisions wiped out cities gone dark, he fell into absolute silence. For nearly a week, Stalin vanished from public view. Moscow had no orders. The Red Army was paralyzed. Meanwhile, German troops advanced unopposed, encircling entire Soviet armies in massive pockets. Tens of thousands of soldiers starved, ran out of ammunition, and died in the dust. A German officer wrote in his diary, "We have created cemeteries of men." When Stalin finally reappeared, he was no longer fearful. He was furious. His orders were brutal and uncompromising. Not one step back. Any man who retreats will be shot. Over 100,000 Soviet soldiers were executed for cowardice. But paradoxically, that terror held the Red Army together long enough for it to survive. By late summer, the Germans had advanced nearly 700 kilometers into Soviet territory. But the roads of Russia were not like those of France. When the autumn rains came, they turned the land into a vast sea of mud, a nightmare known to the soldiers as the Rasputitsa. Panzers sank axle-deep in muck. Horses collapsed and died. Infantrymen pushed heavy artillery pieces through knee-deep sludge. Behind them, the supply lines, stretching hundreds of kilometers, were torn apart by Soviet partisans attacking from the forests. A German officer wrote, "We can defeat the enemy, but we cannot defeat this land." As the front lines closed in on major Soviet cities, Stalin made one of the most extraordinary decisions in history. He ordered the complete relocation of Soviet industry. Over 1,500 factories were dismantled piece by piece and moved east across the Volga River into the Ural Mountains and deep into Siberia. Millions of workers, men, women, and even children lived and worked in freezing conditions, rebuilding the war machine from the ground up. Within months from the snow and ash, new tanks began to emerge: the T-34, the finest medium tank of the war, and the Katyusha rocket launchers, whose roar would soon echo across the front lines. The Soviet Union seemed broken, but it was not dead. It was transforming into a juggernaut of steel. While his generals like Guderian and Halder pleaded for a direct strike at Moscow, Hitler hesitated and divided his forces. He ordered Army Group Center to pause, sending its tanks south to encircle Kiev. The result was another massive victory, nearly 700,000 Soviets captured, but it came at a terrible cost time. By the time German troops turned back toward Moscow, the seasons had changed. The rains came, then the frost, then the snow. The Wehrmacht had no winter uniforms, no antifreeze for their engines, no fuel for their trucks, no hope of reaching Moscow before winter swallowed them whole. As temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius, tens of thousands of German soldiers froze to death overnight. Weapons jammed, tanks refused to start. The once proud blitzkrieg had ground to a halt in the snow. Then out of the forests came the Siberian divisions, fresh rested and trained for winter warfare. Dressed in white camouflage, they struck the frozen Germans from the flanks. On December 6, 1941, Marshal Georgy Zhukov unleashed the Soviet counteroffensive. Within weeks, the Red Army drove the Germans back over 100 kilometers from Moscow. For the first time in the Second World War, Hitler's army was in retreat, and Germany would never fully recover. In the frozen trenches, German soldiers wrote letters home. "We are not fighting men. We are fighting the earth itself." The generals pleaded for withdrawal. Hitler refused. No retreat. Hold your ground at any cost. He believed that willpower could replace fuel, that faith could replace logistics, that his word could replace reality. Back in Germany, the illusion of victory began to fade. The triumphant headlines disappeared. In their place came endless lists of the dead. Operation Barbarossa was not just a failure. It was the beginning of Germany's downfall. After Moscow, Germany was forced onto the defensive. They could no longer conquer all of Russia, but they also could not retreat. The war in the East had become a vast machine of attrition, and it would devour everything. In the summer of 1942, Hitler sought redemption in the south at Stalingrad, where the last illusions of his empire would drown in blood and snow. The numbers tell a story of horror. Over 5 million Soviet casualties in the first year alone. Nearly 1 million civilians murdered in occupied territories. More than 300,000 German soldiers killed or missing before winter. But beyond numbers lay a greater truth. The balance of the war had shifted. From this moment on, Germany would no longer be the hunter. It would become the hunted. Operation Barbarossa was a tragedy of arrogance and delusion. It destroyed not only millions of lives, but also the very belief that Germany was destined to rule the world. Hitler believed that willpower could overcome reality, that by kicking in the door the Soviet Union would collapse. But he forgot that behind that door stood an entire nation ready to die rather than surrender. From the muddy fields of 1941 to the smoking ruins of Berlin in 1945, the thread that connects them all is the failure of Barbarossa. And history, cold and unyielding like the Russian winter, has preserved its lesson. No empire can ever defeat a nation determined to survive.